Hey, what's going on, guys and gals? I am very excited this morning to be introducing Marshall Thomas. He's recently joined the community. He's up there with one of the group expert badges by his name, and he definitely lives up to that. He's also one of our moderators, and we're going to be going over just about the complete video on routing when it comes to the X32 and the M32 mixers. All right, so Mr. Thomas, take it away, brother.
Thanks, Dana. Thanks for having me. As Dana said, I'm new into the X32 rack users, but Dana knows me from another group. I've been went up the X32 consoles for about 6 years now, so almost since they've been around. And I've been trying to help people with routing as much as I can. If you guys have questions after you guys see this video up on YouTube, you can just message me in the comments on the group, and I'll try to find you as fast as possible. So, short introductions, let's get started. First, I'm going to start with an overview of the 3 different consoles. There's a full-size, a compact, and a X32 rack. I'm not going to mention the producer because not many people use it because it has some issues. Let me share my screen. Okay, so here we go. This is the X32 full-size. As you guys can see, you have 32 XLR inputs, all do have phantom power, 16 XLR outs. You have 6 aux ins. Aux 5 and 6 also have an RCA in addition to 1/4 inch. Same for your aux outs. 2 AESs, which is standard on all consoles. Alternate, an AES, which by default is on all consoles the main left-right. It's a secondary output. You got MIDI control. You got remote control, Ethernet. The full-size and compact have this USB port, which is defunct. It was originally planned for X-Edit to be wired. They killed that idea. The producer and the rack do not have it because it was after that plan. Here's the expansion card slot, which by default on most is the X-USB. Then you have this monitor control room out. A lot of people think you can see this XLR and use it as like a floor monitor output. No. This is for your solo bus on the console. This is meant to feed near fields if you're in a studio, or a headphone amp or some other kind of setup at front of house. This is not for stage monitors. Please do not do that. This is the compact. As you can see, we still have the same monitor section, but the talkback is now moved to the rear of the console. On the full size, it's up front. You also have your lamp jack back here now. The aux outs are now up here. You still have XLR outputs, but you have half. So 16 and 8. USB interface, remote control, only Ethernet works again. MIDI, that AES, that's the stereo output of your main left-right, alternate, and your standard Ethercon for AES. And then we have the rack that everyone loves. Basically the exact same look that the back of the compact has. The only difference is you do not have that USB port for the remote anymore because when the rack came out, that idea had gone by the dodo bird. Ignore this card. This is the original card that the X32 and the racks came with, which was the XUF. That has been replaced by the XUSB. And in some consoles, if you get what's called the live packages, you will have the one that has USB on one side and 2 SD cards, so you can do full multi-track recording directly on the console. So if you guys are seeing the different SKU numbers and wondering what the difference between a normal X32 system and the X32 live consoles are, it's the default expansion card. If it doesn't say live, it's a standard USB card. If it says live, it's got the X32 live card, which can do multi-tracking built in. That's the only difference. And then, since we're going to get into routing now, let me bring over this. We'll briefly talk about the different stage boxes. There's the S series and the SD series. They are a little bit different in how they operate. This one is the S16. 16 in, 8 out. I don't have a photo of the rear, but on the rear is an alternate port, which is fed via AES 41 to 48. And if you're not feeding that, the alternate port on the stage boxes will not work. That is the same for all of them, basically. The S16 is unique in all of the stage boxes that it can be a clock master. You would select that by holding config and using this adjust to change the mode. I'm not going to go over that. It's in the manual. If you guys want, reach out to me. The other use for why you would want clock master is sometimes a clock in a console can be a little off, or you're using multiple consoles and you prefer the stage box to be a clock. The other reason that's unique to the S16, if you guys read the manual, you can set one of these as a clock master, another one as a AES clock sync, and connect two S16s together and have the inputs of one S16 go to the outputs of another S16. In essence, creating a digital snake for an analog console or other purposes. It's kind of a cool idea that Behringer has. Not many people use it, but it is there. And one other thing that's true with the S16 and the S32, on the back of the console is what looks like a Toslink port for a TV. It's actually something different called ADAT. Each port is 8 channels. And in the AES signal, it is 17 to 32. So you can actually have, with 2 S16s plugged in and the primary unit, the first one, not the second one, you can have 2 ADAT devices plugged in like the Behringer 88 8000 or 8200, which converts from ADAT to XLR. You could have 32 outputs in a system. We'll talk about that later when we get into more routing of why you would want that, but you can do it.
Now, I want to interject here just for a second. When they're hooking this up, 9 times out of 10, they're not going to be using that. As far as,
Correct.
just for that other stuff going in is, just linking it together to have something similar to the full-size desk. And when it comes through that when you're going to use the 2 S16s, you would come out of, say, your A port from the rack into the A port of the first S16. And then go out of the B port of the first S16 back into the A port of the second S16, because I get that question a lot. People are going from B port to B port, and it doesn't function that way.
And another thing to mention, too, is on the second S16, the config, like I mentioned, Clockmaster. If you guys read the manual, there's like 8 different modes these things can be in. The first unit in the dual S16 needs to be mode 1, which is AES sync outputs 1 through 8. The next one, you're going to want to do mode 2, which is still AES sync, but you'll see this light on the front of the stage box that says out plus 8 get engaged. So what that will do is the 8 outputs on the second S16 unit will be outputs 9 through 16. If you don't have that plus 8 mode, you will be confused and wondering why both of your stage boxes are outputting the exact same signals. That's how you change it.
Very good.
And then here's the S32. The S32, this is one thing that a lot of people get tricked up. They're like, hey, can I daisy chain an S32 off of an S16? Because unlike the S16, the S32 is not configurable to be anything. It's always going to be an AES clock sync. It cannot be an AES master. So people get confused. Can it even be daisy chained? Yes. There's 2 ways. One is Behringer's official answer. The other one we've confirmed works, but Behringer is questionable about it. The official way Behringer wants you to do it is the S32 first, linked from its B port to the A port of the S16, and have the S16 in mode 3 or 4, I believe it is. I'll have to relook at the manual and tell you guys in the comments. The unofficial way is having the S16 first in mode 1 and the S32 after. Both options, you will have all your inputs correctly. The problem is, in the unofficial method, sometimes not all outputs will work correctly. That's why Behringer recommends that the S16 be second because you can actually offset its outputs in its mode select. The S32 will not do that. So that is why Behringer's recommends, if you're using an S32 with an S16, S32 first, then S16. That's Behringer's recommendation. So those are the S series of console or stage boxes. Let's get into the SD, which are a little bit weirder. These are the SDs, which were originally meant for the X-Air. Most people do not realize that. The biggest difference is there's a small Ultranet hub. Both the S16 and S32 have a single Ultranet port. The SD8 has 2, and the SD16 has 4, which I'll show you guys later. The USB port, that is not for audio. Everyone sees the USB port on all the stage boxes and like, oh, I can plug it as an interface. No, it's for updating firmware. There's a special utility that you download on the download site of Behringer's website for all of the different stage boxes, and it opens up in a terminal window and updates the firmware for you. That's all that USB port is for. There is no audio passing through it. The other difference you'll notice on the SD series is, unlike, let me go back to like S32, it's standard Neutrik X32, XLR connectors for your inputs. The SD series use combo jacks. So it's a 1/4 inch and a XLR. Note, however, only 7 and 8 have built-in transformers like a built-in DI box. If you plug into 1 through 6 on an SD8, you still need to technically have a DI box to go from 1/4 inch to XLR. If you plug into 7 and 8, you can nix the DI, but only on 7 and 8. That's why it says high Z. The other difference you have to pay attention to SD series, unlike the S series, is on the side, there's a switch for the outputs. It's kind of similar to the S16, but there's not a menu system. You just have a switch. That's how you choose what the outputs are. The inputs will auto-configure when you're daisy chaining. The outputs, you select the switch if you want 1 through 8, 9 through 16, 17 to 24. That's how you change the outputs on an SD series of stage boxes. And again, you have 2 AES ports. And again, recommendation, A port always goes to your console. B port goes to A of the next unit in the chain. You cannot go B port to B port on any of the stage boxes. Like Data mentioned, it will not work. Then we have the SD16. Again, combo jacks. This is what I was meaning about the Ultranet hub. Instead of having 1 Ultranet port versus the S series of boxes and 2 of the SD8, you have 4 ports, which for smaller bands, if you're using the rack with this could be very helpful to get. If you're only using a couple of P16s, you wouldn't need a P16D or anything to power all your P16s. It would come straight off of this. It will not always power them sometimes, though. It's still recommended that you use the supplied power adapter for the P16s. And just like the SD8, you have combo jacks. And again, the last 2 are the only ones that have built-in transformer or DI use. And just like the SD8, you have an output switch configuration for your outputs and the USB port for firmware updates on the side on this unit. And that is the differences between your stage boxes.
Quick question, Marshall.
Yes.
If you bring up your last picture on the output, because I get this a lot too, that people say, well, look, we've only got 16 outputs, but yet I have a switch for 17 through 24.
So like the S series, like let me go back to, like I was saying on the S series, there's an ADAT port on the back that is 17 to 32. The SD series don't have the ADAT ports that the S16 and the S32 do. So the way they get around that is they know that you're probably going to be chaining like at least 3 of these units together if you wanted, like specifically with the SD16. If you want to do full 48 channels, which there's a caveat to that, I'll get to, you're going to need 3 of these units, which means you will have more than 16 outputs. That is why that switch exists. So the first unit would be inputs 1 through 16, output 1 through 8. The second SD16 would then be inputs 17 to 32, flip the switch down to 9 through 16. Then your last SD16 would be inputs 33 to 48, and you'd have outputs 17 to 24 from the AES signal. So it is a way of getting past that 16 limit of outputs via just AES. It's just different ways of doing it between the two different series of stage boxes. Like I said, again, the SD line were originally meant for the X Air, but people have adapted to use them for the X32 line, and they work just as well. AES is AES. I don't have them pictured here. If you guys actually want to get even more high quality sound, there's a big debate about that. I'm not going to get into this, but electronically, the true Midas Pro amps, so basically the blue DL stage boxes, the DL16, DL32 are a little different. They're black stage boxes that were specifically meant for the M32. They are still better preamps, but the bigger ones like the DL251, 351, those will work on an X32. And you will get much, much better preamp sound. So that's another option for you guys out there if you're not happy with the preamps of an X32 system. There are the Midas Pro stage boxes. Yes, they're very expensive, but if you want to go for them, you can. The biggest thing you have to note about, say, specifically the DL251, which is 16 in, 8 out like an S16, it does not daisy chain like an S16. The DL251s have to be home run. So if you are using an X32 rack, or any of the X32s actually, to get 32 inputs with the DL251 with 2 stage boxes, you are going to be using both of your AES connections on the board. There is no way around that. That DL251, it's meant, since it is meant for the bigger Pro series, like the Pro 2, the Pro 3, the Pro 6, the Pro 9, those consoles would typically have way more AES ports than what we have on an X32. We're talking sometimes 8 ports.
Right, yeah.
And they also used to have with the XL8 series and the Pro X, which recently got discontinued, there was AES routers, which were built into the mix engine. So you could actually, in a stage link, have multiple DL251s, and it would link into an AES router, which would then send a 2-pair, sometimes 3-pair, back to the console. And that's the big difference between the X32 and the bigger Midas Pro consoles I'll talk about briefly. With an X32, if you're running 2 AES lines, you're going to have 2 completely different AES signal sound. You're going to have A and B. Where with the Pro Series consoles, that is not always the case. They do something called redundancy. It's called an XY plus 1. You will have 2 cables per AES link. There's redundancy there. So if one fails, the other one picks up. The X1 is also the redundancy for both of those. So if one fails, the other one picks up. And this is the biggest difference of why you will always see 2 as well on the Pro versus M/X2. The X32 and the M32 run at 48 kilohertz max. So as I was saying, the biggest difference between the M32, X32, and the Midas Pros is clock rate. X32, M32, it's 44.1 or 48. Midas Pros typically want to run at 96 kilohertz. That 96 is why you'll see dual link plus redundant. AES on X32, M32 at 48 kilohertz is 48 bidirectional channels. On Midas Pro, however, at 96 kilohertz, channel count gets halved to 24. So if you're using one of the larger stage boxes, like the 351, which is 48 by 16, I believe, you will need 2 AES connections to run the entire stage box. It will still work, but you're going to need both connections. Just like the 251s, you're going to need both AES ports, unfortunately. Now let's
Good to know.
Now let's get to IEM systems. The 2 biggest ones right now, if we're talking about non-wired, like coming out your XLR ports, is, let me pull it up here and go to routing. You have everyone's favorite, the P16 system. which comes off the alternate port. Again, like I stated, if you're using the stage boxes, you have to make sure that the last two blocks in your AES section says alternate. I'll show that here. AES, go down here, say we're connected to the A port, 33 to 40 says alternate 1 through 8, and alternate 9 through 16 is AES 41 to 48. If that is not selected on any of the stage boxes, S or SD series, the alternate ports will be basically dead. They will have no signal. So check that in your routing. It's easy to get mixed up sometimes, especially if you're doing dual consoles, which we'll talk about. In alternate, though, there is only 16 channels. It's a little limited, but if you want to get away from that, if you scroll, you can see you have tons of options. Obviously, you have direct out, so you can choose from any of your channels. Now, one thing to help with the P16s is create a mix bus. I usually prefer to do 8 for my consoles. I will set that up as a drum mix. So I can send all of my drum channels, however many I have. So kick, snare, tom, floor tom, overheads, talking a minimum 5 channels. If you're to send that to the P16, you've now severely limited yourself because you have 5 channels being sent for just one person in the band. If you send it to a mix bus first and then send it out to the P16, those 5 channels are now only burning up one section in the P16 system. And if the drummer just needs something adjusted, they can either have a phone or a tablet locked into the board's Wi-Fi, or they can just ask you to adjust it. Typically, though, once you get that drum mix set up correctly when you're working with the drummer, it shouldn't really need to be adjusted for the individual levels inside. Volume overall, they're going to want to change, which they can do. The other thing you can do that's kind of interesting, a more recent firmware that most people don't know about, you can send your 6 matrix outs. People are like, why would you want to do that? Matrices are not just for sending your main left-right to create a stream feed or an auxiliary output for delay speakers or things like that. Matrix can be used to receive from any bus. Simplest idiotic way to think of matrices is it is a bus that instead of receiving from the channels, it receives from other buses, be that buses 1 through 16 or the main LR/mono channels. That is how the matrices work in an X32. So because of that, if you wanted to sum multiple buses together to go to the P16s, you would then use a matrix for that.
And you could have guitar buses, drum buses, key buses, depending on what you have on stage.
Exactly. So like if you, again, like multiple guitars, some bands I've seen have 3 guitars. You have your lead, your rhythm, and then one that's like kind of a stylized backup. Again, if you don't want to eat 3 channels in your P16, since you only have 16 to play with, create a bus that sends all of them together.
Well, I was going to mention too, Marshall, that it is so important to sit there and literally map out on paper what you've got coming into it, how many buses you're going to need for your monitors, and lay all this stuff out so when you get to piece this together, it'll make a lot more sense to you.
Yeah, and I'll have Dana share this file at the end of the video going uploaded. I will share with you guys something that I have, which is an Excel spreadsheet that is a patch list. If you guys do not have a patch list in your setup, please go download this template I'm giving you guys. It allows you to say what your stage boxes are, what the channel is plugged into on the stage box. It then also has a section for the console side, either physical or if it's coming from a digital stage box signal. Then you have channel assignment. What I mean by that is, yes, in all the channels, you can do, this does universal. If you don't change anything, this is what it is. But like say, if I go to channel 1 and I go to config and I'm like, okay, channel 1's actually not there because something got flipped on stage box. I want it here. If you make changes like that, put that in your patch list so everyone that comes to the board that needs to make changes in the future knows that.
It will save a whole lot of confusion, nasty emails, and very bitter communications between you and somebody else that's not aware of it.
Not just that, but it'll also help you out when you have one of those oh crap moment happens if something breaks. You can quickly look at your patch list and it will help you quickly solve problems faster than having to try to remember, okay, if that plugs in there, that then goes here, that then routes here. No, don't try to remember it. Have it all written down.
Oh,
it's
absolutely.
Cleaner, it's better.
Because you'll be in the back of it, you'll be looking for cables, you'll be looking for something unplugged because you're not getting a signal into it. And it's literally something as simple as a mouse click.
And then in addition to just Stage Box versus console, it then also has, like I said, all the channel configs. The next section will also have your outputs. You may not think having your outputs listed on a patch list is useful, but it comes up handy when someone else is coming in. Like if you have stage monitors with wired in-ears, you're not going to always use your stage monitors. It may be for a guest speaker or a guest singer. So you're not keeping them plugged in all the time. Sometimes you'll have volunteers that are like, hey, where do these monitors plug in? Being able to quickly have a patch list that you have at booth and look up and be like, plug it into this output and this output for the monitors. Or even better yet, this is what I do. Keep a laminated, keyword on that, laminate it, please. Laminated copy of your patch sheet near your stage box. It's a small difference, but having that right near your stage box at all times, anyone that walks up to that stage box, if they need to know anything about the patching, the patch list is right there. If you need to go back and fix something again during a no crap moment, the patch list is right there. It saves time. Anything you can do to save time, do it.
Very
now
good.
Back to the Ultranet. You also have direct out, and then you have direct out auxes. So aux 1 through 6 is the aux jacks on the back of the console. 7/8 is a weird one. 7/8, let me minimize this and I'll show you guys. 7/8 by default is the stereo USB playback on the console. It's not the USB card on the back. The USB port on the top that you use for firmware updates and all that. It also does recording and playback. If you go here, you see this playback section I have. On the physical console, if you hit the view button next to the USB port, it brings up the playback engine. If you're playing something back from that USB thumbstick, it by default goes to 7 and 8. Again, just like any other channel, you can change its source. But by default, that is what aux 7 and 8 is. Confuses a lot of people because they're like, I thought it was only a 6 aux board. 7 and 8's an internal one. So just be aware of that. And then you have direct out FX. That is going down here to this. By default, FX slots 1, 2, 3, and 4 have dedicated returns. If you're sending a bus to them, they're going to dedicate send out here. These only get used if you're doing send return. Insert will deactivate these, by the way. But by default, as you can see, FX1 is 1, 2, 3, 4. That is what that is selected in the P16 system is if you want to select the returns of the FX into the P16s. Yes, I know I'm already hearing people cry, oh, why would you want FX in your in-ears? Yes, for a band, that could be detrimental, but a lot of singers will want just a little bit of reverb so it doesn't sound so dry to them in their ears. They're used to hearing the ringing of the room and the reverb you already have in the room.
Right.
So just giving them a little bit of reverb in the in-ears will help. And again, every singer's different. For example, my worship pastor that I work with wants a lot of verb in her ears. The other singers hardly want any. You just got to work with your singers and figure out what they want. And then you have your monitor section. The LR here for monitor is the solo bus that we talked about earlier that's on the outputs on the back of the console. Anytime you see anything in the X32 edit or the console itself that says monitor LR, that is your solo bus. It will always refer to the solo bus. And then TB is talkback. The talkback on the physical top of the console. By default, it will always choose A. It will also do B, but there's a way to deactivate that. Topic for a different video. But that is how you get your talkback into a P16 if your band's on P16 and you don't want to yell at them. Plug a mic into the XLR port for talkback, select external, and when you hit talk A or talk B, it will go to whatever channel you assign in the P16. That is the basics of the P16, except for down here. Notice all of these are green. If you look at X edit down here, it gives you a nice little key. Green with a circle means pre-EQ, which means anything you've done to EQ source in the room will not be heard in P16. A lot of times that's great. Sometimes with singers, you're going to want to switch it to yellow. And there we go. If you select, sorry, it's going up above to a second screen for me. If you right-click these, it brings up a little pop-up that will give you all these options, and you can choose it. So like right now, I'm going to choose post EQ, and you'll see that one turns yellow. So you can change the tap points of how you're sending to the P16s. And again, this is the little chart. Typically, you will never do the purple. Never do purple post fade for a in-ear send. That's just asking for troubles. What that will mean is anything you do in your main mix as you are mixing the board, it will automatically change levels in the in-ears. You do not want that. Probably want to stay with any of these top circles, which is input, pre-EQ, post-EQ, and pre-fader. Sometimes, very small niche, you're going to want to go to the solid options. As you can see, it says plus mute on these. What that means is if you mute in the house, it will mute in the in-ears. Sometimes that can be beneficial. For instance, like say this one, direct channel 1, say that is your pastor's headset. You would probably want to select that as pre-EQ mute, because you don't want your band hearing in their in-ears the pastor's headset the entire service during worship when it's on. If you have it to a pre-EQ mute, as soon as you unmute them in the room for the audience to hear, they will also hear them in their in-ear system. But they won't get annoyed by hearing the pastor try to sing or sing. Some pastors can sing, but they won't have to hear that in their in-ear system when his headset has been turned on at the beginning of service. But typically, all your sources do not have the mute. It will do some odd things for the musicians. So that's your P16 system.
Well, one thing it'll do is get their attention if you mute it, because I guarantee you're going to be the first one they're looking at.
Very true. There's that old photo of the birds from a Disney movie that always go like, mine, mine, mine. And it just has them looking at it. It's like the view from the audience every time something goes around at the sound booth. It's a very true statement. So that's your guys' overview of the Ultranets. If you have any questions, again, reach out to me or Dana. We're friendly to help. Now, the other newer in-ear system, besides buses, we'll talk about that in a second, is something that was originally meant for the Behringer Wing. I'm going to preface that right now. Everyone wonders about the DP48s and why it's set up the way it is and why it's a little complicated sometimes. It came out the same time as the Behringer Wing. The Behringer Wing does not have an Ultranet port like our X/M32 consoles we're used to. It only has AES, 3 AES ports to be specific. So because of that, the DP48 was coming out. Behringer, in their niceness, allowed it to still work on M32 and X32 with the current firmware. Because of that, though, it does operate very differently. That means, I've seen people ask this, can you daisy chain a DP48 system off of a stage box? Yes, you can. The only problem with that is, be it S16 single or dual, or an S32, however you want to take it, the first either 8 or 16 channels of the AES line that you're sending to the stage box for its XLR outputs will also be the first 8 or 16 channels that the DP48 sees as well. There is no way around that. If you're linky, if you want the DP48 to have all 48 channels completely separate from whenever you're doing to a stage box, the DP48s do have to be home run to the console directly. That does mean if you are using Midas Pro stage boxes, sorry, you will not be able to use a DP48 if you're using 2 DL251s. It's just not going to happen. Sorry, guys. But the way you would route a DP48 system is if you were doing, say, dual console setups. You would go to AES 50, which is your output section. We're not going to look at A. We are assuming that A will always be your stage boxes. B, you would then select it to be whatever your inputs are. So like say, for instance here, we are local. We're using either a full-size X32 with all 32 inputs, or we're only using an X32 rack, but we're only using the 16 inputs local. You go to AESA, and we're going to go to B, select where it says B 1 through 8, hit select local. That will then send all the 32 channels coming into the board, 16 if you're on a rack, to the DP48 system. DP48, yes, it has 16 buttons like the P16. You set up groups. That is typically done on the DP48 itself, or people have always asked, can you do it on the console? Yes, you can. It's hidden, though. It's not going to show up in X32 Edit for some reason, but if you are on a console, it will show up. Go to User. Go past it one more time to the right, and you will see a thing that says DP48 Group Assignment. And you can go through and choose your groups and what channels they are from the console, and it will push to the DP48s. I do not know why it's not in Xedit yet, but it is on the console. That is one thing I'm going to tell you guys. The other thing you may be noticing is DP48. 48 probably means 48 channels. Yes, it does. It's the full AES. So if we're sending all 32 channels here, what else could we send? Well, if you scroll all the way down here, Ultranet, probably not going to want to send that, but you could send some of your outputs. You could also send your auxes. Typically, I will always do auxes as last, 41 through 48. People are like, why would you want to send your auxes to in-ears? If you have a per presenter setup and you guys are doing intro videos, that is very helpful having the audio, the intro video go into the in-ear system for the band. Because as soon as they hear that, they know, hey, intro video is starting, it's about ready for service to start. That is very helpful. As for what you're going to do with the other 8, that is up to you guys. You could choose it to be Ultranet and output section. You can also select user so you can get a little bit more funky with it. But typically speaking, the most you're going to be doing is whatever your channels are coming from. So it could be local. If you're using local stage boxes, it will be AES-A. Don't send B to B. It will not work. It's just going to send a dead loop of no signal. Don't even know why that's an option, but it is. And then your last one, you can send your aux input so you can get them. And then 33 to 4, you can just be kind of a floater for whatever you guys want. That gets you guys set up with P16 and DP48. Now, as I mentioned, you can do wired in-ears. How would you do wired in-ears? Typically, you're going to be using outputs 1 through 16. As you see here, this is a default loadout. This is showing what it would be for a full-size console, 16 outputs. By default, mix bus 1 through 12 is assigned to outputs 1 through 12. FX mix bus, not the returned, the send. Keep that in mind. The send is on 14 and 15. And then 15, 16 is your main left, right. On the compact and the rack, just delete 9 through 16. So it'd be buses 1 through 6 to outputs 1 through 6. And 5 and 6 would be FX. Again, 1, 2, the bus, not the return. People get confused. And then 7, 8 on compact and rack is by default your mains output. Again, you guys can change this to anything you want. This is just your default. So since we have 12 mix buses, that would be your in-ear mixes. Either a floor wedge, going to a headphone amp, going to a wireless IEM transmitter. Doesn't matter the destination. This is where you do your source. Each of these by default will be mono. To get a stereo mix bus in an X32 system, we go to bus matrices. Let me select the mixer. You select your bus, go to config, and there's a stereo link. When you click it, it's going to ask you, are you sure you want to link? Click yes, you'll see this little LR pop up. It's now linked. What happens when you link? First of all, 2 things. One mix bus 1 and 2 are now linking as a stereo like your main LR, which is already by default a stereo bus. One thing to know about linking, because I get this asked a lot, you cannot link even to odd. So mix bus 1 to 2 will work. 2 to 3 will not work. I'll show you what I mean. If I go to 4 and I try to hit stereo link, watch the message. It asks if I want 3 and 4 linked, not 4 and 5. That is unfortunately a limitation in the way the console is routed. You can only ever link odd to even. This is not just for mix buses, by the way. This is for everything on the console, including your input channels. Just a little gotcha for people to know about. So now that we have a single stereo mix bus, people will be like, why would you want a stereo mix bus versus mono? Because if I said I wasn't using FX, that would give me 8 stereo mix buses. Okay, but right now I have 12 mono. Why would I want to lose mix buses to just go stereo? For band members and singers, especially singers, stereo in-ears can be much more beneficial because you can now pan. What I mean by that is if I go to channels, select channel 1, for instance, click my sends page, you notice instead of the on-off button that 1 through 12 has, I only have a single on-off button for my send now to 1 and 2, and I now have a pan. So I can actually choose how much to the left or the right I'm sending to that person's in-ears. That can be very useful because for singers, a lot of how they sing is situational awareness. What I mean by that is when you're on stage, you're used to hearing, like, say, if the drums are behind you to your left, you're going to naturally want to hear them to your left. And on mono mix, everything's going to be straight dead center. The stereo mix bus, you can actually start panning the sources to how the singer or performer hears it on stage naturally. It takes that little bit of weirdness out of mono mixes. Yes, it does burn up channels. We'll get a way around that. But that is how you pan. And this is going off of a comment that someone asked in the forum the other day. They were like, I don't like how the pan is automatically doing what I'm doing in the room. If you go to channel here, you can see there's a pan here for your main left, right. That was going straight to their send, and they couldn't figure out why. There's this little button right here that says LR pan. Show you how that works. I'll go back to channel. Let's pan this all the way left. Go back to sends, pan this all the way to the left. They're completely different now. Watch this pan flip to the right the second I hit this button. It is now following whatever the channel pan is in the main left-right mix. Sometimes that can be a very useful thing. For most in-ear cases, though, make sure it's turned off. The only time you're ever going to want this turned on a mix bus is if that stereo mix bus is going to your live stream, because that will help out your live stream simplistic sake for whoever's mixing. They then only have to worry about channel rate, fader rates, and mixing it as if a normal mix. They don't have to worry about the pans then. They let whoever the FOH engineer is deal with the pan control. That is a big gotcha you got to care about if you're on stereo mix buses. This page is also where you can choose per channel your tap point to mix buses for in-ears or a live stream. You got input. What input means is that is straight from the preamp, no dynamics. So your gate and your compressor, they will have no effect here. Pre-EQ, dynamics will now take effect. Post-EQ, you now have the EQ in the system. Pre-fader, mute will take effect. Fader level will not. Post-fader, fader and mute takes effect. Subgroup. This is something completely different. This is not a mix group. Notice it suddenly switches to I cannot have send control. You see I only have on-off here. Subgroups can only send full unity. You cannot change the send. A subgroup is different than a mix bus. What a subgroup is for is, say, drums or vocals. If you wanted to do more processing, like on drums, there's something called parallel compression. What you would do is you would set up all your drums with the way you want them normally, send them to a subgroup. Then you could compress that subgroup even further for what's called drum crush or parallel compression. The way you would then get that is if we go back to my buses, go to channel. By default, mix buses do not send to your main left, right. Since mix bus 1 is now in subgroup mode, you're going to want to select that. That will now send the output of that group directly to your mains. That can be very useful sometimes for, like I said, parallel compression, a little bit of extra EQ. So like if you have choir mics, this can be a godsend to help really dial in your EQ because you would have 2 sets of parametric EQ. The other useful thing is if you don't want to use a DCA. This is the biggest difference between a DCA and a subgroup that we'll talk briefly. DCA, everyone knows about them, got 8 of them. DCA stands for digitally controlled amplifier group, which means no audio passes through a DCA whatsoever. It is just a remote control fader that knows the value of the sum of all the channels assigned to it. No audio. A subgroup, however, does have audio passing through it. So again, if we're talking about the P16s and you want to send all your drums to a single channel, your drum mix could also be your subgroup that's going to the mains to help with a dual use for both cases. So that is the biggest difference between subgroup and regular mix bus. And let me disable that. Okay, so that's your mix buses. That would be for wired in-ears.